Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, where today we're going to be hitting the reset button on the rebuild of the engine for my 1989 Chrysler Conquest, and I'll explain why and how it may have just been a blessing in disguise. It's currently a balmy 21 degrees outside with snow in the forecast, so I fired up my heater back there next to some gas cans and flammable materials, so that'll be good. And hopefully that'll get it up to 22 degrees in here. So as I alluded to, this may have been a blessing in disguise in a couple different ways. I lost a lot of the footage that I had already recorded during the initial build phase, and I was unable to recover any of it, unfortunately. So what got me to this point was, as I was going along and I was installing the pistons, I was using one of those junky piston ring compressors, and I ended up breaking a ring because I wasn't paying close enough attention, and it got twisted inside the compressor and snapped.
Freaking idiot!
So I ordered a new set, and comparing the two sets, the rings were different. It was the second ring that I broke. So the rings were different, and I called Hastings just to confirm that it may have been a design change, because the set that I originally had was from about a year prior, and the set that I got to replace the broken ring was from June of this past year, or July, one or the other. So Hastings asked for some information, part numbers, stuff like that, and they basically confirmed that it's just a design change. There's no difference in performance. They also did recommend that you don't just replace the single ring, that you replace an entire set. So that's what we will be doing. So my intention was only to replace the second ring on all of the pistons so they all match. However, I started getting in my own head about doing this and decided that I'm just going to replace all of the rings on all of the pistons as an entire set. Even if the top ring and the oil ring were all the same, I feel better if I just replace them as an entire set. So that meant, at the very least, that I'm going to have to pop out all 4 pistons and start from scratch. I figured, since I lost all of the footage that I had previously recorded, I would just go all the way back, not necessarily all the way to the beginning. I'm not going to pull the oil squirters out and stuff like that. That's pretty simple. I can explain that as we go. But I took the crank out, cleaned up all the bearings, and this is where this may have been a blessing in disguise. So on piston number 1, when I took the bearings off, you can see that something got in there. There was a piece of dirt or debris of some kind that got in between the journal and the bearing. And it's on both bearings. And yes, my nail can catch it. So not good. There may be different opinions on whether or not this would have been an issue. When I cleaned everything up, I didn't find any piece of debris, but it could have come out when I was cleaning it. Either way, this is far too risky for me, so I decided to order a new set of bearings, and when they get in a couple days, I'll be able to pick up where we're leaving off here. So when I pulled the number 1 piston out and I saw that damage to the bearing, I decided I'm not going to play around. I'm going to pull the crank out, I'm going to clean it up, and I'm just going to double check everything just to make sure. It's worth the peace of mind to me to do this now than take a chance and have it be more expensive down the road. 25 bucks for a set of rod bearings is certainly cheaper than having to send this thing back to the machine shop again. We got a lot of ground to cover today. However, first things first. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. So make sure that all of your main bearing surfaces are clean, free of debris, oil, or anything else that could get between the bearing and the block surface. Now this block has already been cleaned and washed and everything after it came back from the machine shop. So just remember, we're hitting the reset button here on this rebuild because of breaking that piston ring. So I'm going to grab some brake clean and we'll start cleaning. The one thing I do want to note here is that I already have all of my clearances checked. I'm not going through all of that again in here, because if I measure something that's, you know, 1/1000th of a thousandth off, then I'm going to start getting paranoid and I'm going to have to remeasure every single thing, and I'm just going to drive myself crazy. Okay, so while we're at this point, I feel like it's worth pointing out, just so we don't leave anything out that might be important. Your oil squirters that you have for each cylinder bore, you have 2 that point to the front, 2 that point to the rear. Let me get you flipped around here and I'll show you. Okay, so you have your oil squirters there in each cylinder. And you'll notice there's 2 that point towards the front, 2 that point towards the rear. So you want to make sure you get these oriented properly. They do have a locator pin built into them. That would be right down here. That will align them for you, but you want to make sure that you have 2 pointing to the front and then 2 pointing to the rear. And then you want to torque these down to 22 foot-pound. You can get new crush washers for these, and anytime you're installing anything that has crush washers, it's recommended that you replace them. Another thing to point out here is that the grooved bearings go into the block. Your bearing set will come with a grooved side and a non-grooved side. The grooved side goes into the block. Okay, now it's time to grab some lube and our crank. Okay, my lube of choice is Permatex Ultra Slick. I've seen it used by multiple engine builders on YouTube, recommended by friends who have done this, and this stuff it's honestly, it's like dealing with snot. So we'll take a little bit of this, we'll get it on our main bearings, and we'll get it onto our crank journals, and we'll get the crank installed. Crank is seated. I'll grab our main caps, lube them up, and install those. Okay, same treatment for the main caps and bearings. You want to make sure that the caps are completely dry and clean, nothing between the bearing and the cap. And then install the bearings into the caps, and we'll get them installed into the block. And you want to line up your tang with the groove on the main cap. And just kind of roll your bearing in. All the caps are numbered, and they have a directional orientation that they must be installed in. Arrow faces towards the front of the engine. All right, you want to lubricate the bearing on the main cap, and then we'll get them installed. Now, when installing your main bolts, you want to make sure that you put a thin film of oil on the bolt threads. Just get a little bit on your finger. That's all it needs. Now for your number 1 and 2 main, they have a specific bolt for mounting your pickup tube. So you want to ensure that you don't get those mixed up. and then just continue from there until you get all your bolts installed and finger tight. Okay, now that they're all finger tight, you may need to take your plastic mallet and just tap on the main cap just to get it to seat properly. I'll take my special hammer and just tap it down. So this is pretty important. So now that you have your crank in there and you have all your main bolts finger tight, you want to set your thrust bearing. And you do this by prying the crank forward or backward to get that bearing set. Okay, so you want to take your pry bar and you want to find a spot in here that you can pry against where you can move your crank forward and then back. Pry it forward and then pry it back. I do this a couple times just to make sure that that bearing is set. Now that you've set your thrust bearing, you want to keep your pry bar in there, just a little bit of pressure in either direction. You want to just snug your number 3 main cap. Okay, now that your center cap is snug, you remove the bar and then torque all of your main caps to 61 foot-pounds in 3 stages. So I normally do 20, 40, then 61. The correct sequence is center cap, number 2, number 4, number 1, then number 5. As you torque your caps, just give the crank a quick rock back and forth just to make sure there's no binding. Do it with each cap. That way, if something does bind, you know exactly where the problem is. You set the first one at 20 foot-pounds. Set my torque wrench to 40. Set the torque wrench to 61.
Several days later.
We are back with parts and koozie in tow. I got my bearings in from Dad's today. I don't know that we're going to get to that point today with a lot of the other stuff that we got to get wrapped up from where we left off the other day. Again, it's cold, so let's get this bag off here and we'll pick up where we left off. We got the crank in, main cap's torqued, and we're ready to check the crank float. So try to explain this a little bit, how that works, what it is, how you check it, and hopefully shed a little bit of light on this because it tends to be a topic of confusion. So I'll try to explain this as best I can and show you as well.
Early the next morning.
Well, good morning. It's a few days later. It's Saturday morning, about 11:09 or 7, dark 30 in the morning. But this is probably the only opportunity that I'm going to have to get out here and get anything done on this in the next week or so. So let's talk about where we left off and what we have for today. So last time we left off, we had block cleaned, the oil squirters in with new crush washers, main bearings installed, crankshaft installed, main caps installed, everything torqued, and the thrust bearing set. So that leaves us with measuring and recording our crank float. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what crank float is, why it's important, how it's determined, and how we measure it. Welcome to Mark's Mechanical Masquerading Instructional Series. Let's talk a little bit about crankshaft end play, which is also known as crank end float. So in simplest terms, crank float is how much the crankshaft can move axially, or forward and backward, inside the engine while it rotates. This is actual physical movement back and forth And yes, it's supposed to do that. Here's why. Without it, the entire rotating assembly would likely seize up. In addition, that tolerance is built in to absorb some of the force applied when you're pressing the clutch. Every time you do, that forward force moves the crankshaft the amount of measured float before the thrust bearing takes the rest of the hit. So now I'll have you step 2.7 feet to my right into my theory room to use some diagrammicals to hopefully better explain this. So how do we determine how much crank float we have? Simple way and correct way is by asking a qualified professional. The other way is by using a dial indicator, which is exactly what the qualified professional is going to do, except, they have experience. You want to take your dial indicator and mount it to the block and then pry your crank all the way to the rear. You'll then place the tip of the indicator on the snout of the crank and zero your gauge. That's your starting point. Then you'll take your pry bar and pry the crank all the way forward. Note the measurement indicated on the dial. That is your measured crank float. For the 4G50 forklift, the minimum is 0.02 of an inch and the maximum is 0.07 of an inch. The amount of crank float you have is determined by the difference between the crankshaft thrust surfaces and the engine's thrust bearings. Remember, we talked about our mains and main bearings. We have 5 mains. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, you can count. Good for you.
And therefore 5 main bearing sets. The number 3 main, right here, is where your thrust bearing resides. Also note the difference between your thrust bearing and your other main bearings. The thrust bearing has flanges that will extend over the sides of the number 3 main bore and cap. These flanges are what will absorb any crankshaft thrust surface contact as it moves axially. So imagine once again that you're looking at the top down, and this is your number 3 main bore. Sitting inside that main bore, depicted in green, is your thrust bearing. In the center, sitting inside your thrust bearing, is your number 3 main journal. If you recall, I said note the difference between your thrust bearing and your other main bearings, because your thrust bearing has flanges that extend over the sides of the main bore and the number 3 main cap. That will be these here. On either side of those is your center counterweights on your crankshaft. As your crank moves forward and back, it takes up that small amount of space that was determined when we measured crank float. So to recap, too much crank float can cause damage. Too little crank float can cause damage. This concludes today's lesson. So before setting up your dial indicator, you want to force your crankshaft all the way in one direction or the other. So you'll just find a place to get your pry bar. Just give it a shove. That way you know it's all the way in one direction. And now you'll set up your dial indicator. Here's basic setup. Okay, once you get your magnetic base set up, you just want to do some fine adjustments to get this position to where the tip of your gauge just touches the end of the crank snout. Right there is about good. Lock that down. And then we're going to zero out the gauge. This dial indicator is just a piece of junk from Hobo Freight. So you want to be super careful with these for one reason, and that's so that you can return them and get your money back. Okay, so we forced the crank all the way to the rear. So now we'll force it all the way forward to determine our end play. Just a hair under 3/1000. Minimum is 2/1000, maximum is 7/1000. So we're right in spec. Now that we know our end play is measured and in spec, we can package this up and get ready to return it to Hobo Freight. And last but not least, a step that is missed far too often, but is good practice, and a reminder to yourself that you have everything torqued to spec. Take your paint marker and mark all of your main bolts. this out of here before I forget it. I had that in there to pry. I had that in there to pry the number 3 cap up. Fire that into my headlight bolt bag. In my box of goodies. This is all my hardware. All bagged and tagged. Call me crazy, but at least I know I'm not going to have to worry about trying to figure out what bolt goes where. Alright, so I think that'll do it for this video. Next video will be getting the new rings on the pistons, getting the new rod bearings installed, and putting these pistons into the engine. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Sleep tight. Don't let the balance shaft bearings bite.